3 weeks ago, Everett Whitaker, my father, stormed into our apartment screaming that I'd stolen his property. That property was Leah Morgan, the woman I helped escape from our family's control. She defended herself with a knife. Now she's on trial. My mother finally stood up and exposed his abuse. Today Everett is a pariah. He lost everything he thought I'd kneel. I broke the chain. When I turned 18, they held the claiming day. Men cheered while women stood silent, eyes down. I watched Jerry drag a girl by the wrist. That night, my mother pulled me aside and whispered the truth about bruises. Forced silence, the price of rebellion. I couldn't sleep. I stared at the wooden spoon on our kitchen wall, carved by Leah. I vowed I'd never follow their path. That night, I decided I'd save her. 2 weeks later, I saw Everett hit Celeste for letting Leah read a book. He snapped the spine of it, then threw it in the fire. My fists clenched, but I froze. That night, Celeste slipped a journal into my backpack. For her, she whispered. I opened it to find a sketch Leah drew of a gate without locks. That image stayed with me. My family worshipped obedience. I started dreaming about escape. We mapped the escape one corner at a time. Leah memorized shifts. Celeste stole keys. I distracted Jerry with fake plumbing work. One night we made it to the truck, but Everett was waiting at the gate. Leah froze. I grabbed her hand and shouted, "Run!" Celeste slammed the back door to draw him off. We vanished into the woods, headlights sweeping past. At dawn, Leah cried holding the journal. That moment cracked something in me. Fear turned into purpose. Leah flinched every time a man raised his voice. At our safe house, even the sound of a cupboard slamming made her shrink. Celeste called from a burner phone, whispering warnings. Jerry was hunting us. We moved cities, changed names. Roy, my foreman, noticed my exhaustion and offered extra shifts. When I told him everything, he said, "That's not tradition, that's tyranny." He introduced us to a public defender. Hope flickered, but fear never really left us. Catherine Liu, our defender, couldn't believe the tape. Celeste sent recordings of Everett teaching obedience through fear. Leah testified privately, her hands shaking. Catherine said it was enough to open a case, but warned Everett would retaliate. We got anonymous threats, slashed tires, dead birds on our porch. Leah wanted to give up. I showed her the journal again. "This isn't over," I said as she nodded, barely. Every step forward felt like dragging a mountain. But we didn't stop. We met Clara, Leah's sister, in a grocery lot at midnight. She whispered, "He's planning something big." Jerry's watching. Mom. I hugged her, heart pounding. Clara slipped as a flash drive. Inside were recordings of Everett coaching women to recite obedience lines, proof, but Clara begged us not to tell anyone she helped. Leah cried after. "She's still trapped," she said. I clenched the journal. "We get her out too." The storm was coming. We couldn't hide anymore. The courtroom felt colder than any forest we'd fled. Everett entered in a suit, smirking like he still owned the world. Leah held my hand, trembling. The judge called her the defendant. My stomach turned. Catherine played the tapes. Everett's voice echoed commands. "Sirs, possession claims." Celeste walked in with bruises exposed and eyes full of steel. Gasps. Everett's smirk cracked. Leah met his gaze, didn't flinch. That moment, we all knew his empire was about to fall. Everett's lawyer painted Leah as manipulative, calling our escape a delusion. Catherine stood. "These are not traditions," she said. "They're tools of control." The judge asked Celeste one question. "Did he ever hit you?" Silence. Then, "Yes, often." The gallery gasped. Everett shouted, "She's lying." Security stepped in. The judge ruled Leah acted in self-defense. Cheers erupted. Celeste gripped my arm. "You did it," she whispered. I couldn't breathe, but it wasn't fear this time. It was freedom. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. Leah shielded her face. Overwhelmed, I pulled her close. "You're free," I whispered, but freedom came at a cost. Everett's allies turned violent. Jerry slashed our tires again. Clara was dragged home. Celeste went silent. Fear seeped back in. I looked at Leah. "We need to finish this," I said as she nodded. We weren't done. Justice wasn't just a verdict. It was breaking every link in the chain. We found Clara bruised, locked in the old barn. Celeste had slipped her a paperclip to pick the lock. Leah wept holding her. "No more hiding," Clara whispered. We moved them into Roy's spare apartment. Catherine filed new charges: false imprisonment, abuse. Everett's business crumbled. Many once praised him stopped calling. Our story went viral. Messages poured in. Leah carved a new spoon, stronger, thicker, for the next girl. She said we weren't just surviving now, we were rising. Everett made one last move. He sued me for defamation. The court date loomed, but Roy testified about Everett's threats. Clara shared journal entries. Celeste brought an old medical bill with her bruises listed. The judge dismissed his claim. Everett screamed as guards escorted him out. That was the last time I saw him. Leah squeezed my hand. "He's over." But the movement had just begun. We were getting messages daily. Our story was lighting fires. We thought it was over until Jerry returned. He cornered me behind the hardware store with photoshopped images of Leah. Threats to expose them. "One word and she's done," he hissed. I shoved him off and called Catherine. She warned us blackmail was hard to prove. Leah cried. "He'll never stop." I looked at the journal again. It felt heavier now. "Then we exposed them all," I said. That night, we planned to burn the whole thing down. Celeste reached out to old friends, women who had fled decades ago. One sent a folder: names, photos, dates, a history of abuse hidden as tradition. We created a website. Published every file. Anonymous testimonies poured in. Some thanked us, others were terrified. Everett's supporters posted threats. But more voices joined. Clara started a podcast. Leah and I spoke at rallies. The wooden spoon became a symbol online. What once shamed became power. They weren't ready for us. Then Clara vanished. No calls, no messages. Leah broke down. "They took her," she whispered. We traced her last signal: an abandoned cabin near the old farm. Catherine called the police, but no response came. We packed the truck this time. I brought a crowbar. At the cabin, Jerry was waiting. He laughed, said, "Tradition don't die easy." But Clara was already gone. Left minutes before. We searched the woods until sunrise. Leah clutched the spoon and we keep going. A week later, Clara called from 3 states away. Safe, don't come, she whispered. Leah sobbed with relief. Clara had escaped, smuggled out by an ex-member turned ally. We posted her story. It exploded. National media picked it up. Investigators opened a full case into the Whitaker community. Celeste handed over a ledger names of enforcers. Payouts, threats. Leah carved another spoon, mailed it to Clara. It said one word: survivor. The storm was now a reckoning. We were ready. Jerry struck again, this time burning Roy's truck. Carson, no fingerprints, but we knew Roy didn't flinch. Let's go bigger. He said. We launched a petition, gathered 40,000 signatures. Media swarmed to Catherine, filed a civil case. Celeste agreed to testify again. Leah's photo, clutching the spoon, was published nationwide. The backlash was vicious, but the tide shifted. Everett's name was banned from a local school curriculum. That night, we lit candles for every girl silenced, for every voice rising now. They sued us again, this time claiming cultural defamation. Catherine laughed in court. Torture isn't culture. She played another recording, Jerry joking about training wives. Silence followed. The judge dismissed the case immediately. Outside, Leah hugged Celeste. We're not going back, she said. I held the journal as reporters surrounded us. Clara's podcast hit 10,000 listeners. Women across the country reached out. Some had never spoken up before. The legacy was crumbling, and this time, they couldn't bury it. Celeste collapsed during a rally, her lungs weakened by years of trauma. Hospital lights flickered. Leah wept beside her. We were too late, she whispered. But Celeste woke the next day, fragile but smiling. I lived long enough to see it fall, she said. That night, Leah carved a third spoon, for Mom. We held each other, trembling. The movement paused, not from fear but from grief and grace. Then we got back to work. There was more to save. We launched the Spoon Network. A hotline and shelter system. Roy built bunk beds. Clara trained volunteers. Catherine drafted legal templates. Leah's voice became the hotline greeting. Survivors arrived nightly. Some carried children, some just scars. We gave them journals, told them to draw their gates. Each story became a weapon. We weren't just fighting Everett anymore, we were rebuilding something new, stronger, safer. That night, we passed out wooden spoons. One word burned in each, enough. Then came the letter, Everett's appeal. He wanted the verdict overturned. Calling us liars, it shook Leah. He won't quit, she said. But we were different now. Catherine filed a counter motion. Celeste released her journal publicly, decades of abuse written in trembling ink. The judge read it all. Appeal denied. No courtroom, no audience. Just a signature, final. Leah laughed through tears. He doesn't get a stage anymore. We held each other, feeling the silence of real justice. At the Spoon Network's one-year celebration, survivors shared stories. Some had escaped that week. Some had healed enough to speak. Leah stood last. She held up the original spoon, the one she carved hiding under floorboards. This, she said, was never about revenge. It was about freedom. Applause shook the room. Celeste cried. Clara lit a candle for those still missing. We were no longer fugitives. We were builders, witnesses, and our walls were made of courage. Everett died alone in a hospital bed. No visitors, no obituary. Celeste was notified by mail. She lit no candle. He made his choices, she said. Leah baked bread that night, filling the house with warmth. Clara read the names of those still silenced. Roy raised his glass to the ones who survived, and the ones who made survival possible. I stared at the spoon on our mantel. The chain had broken. What remained was ours to shape. Months later, a letter arrived from Congress, a recognition award for Leah and Clara. It wasn't justice, but it was validation. We traveled to D.C., our spoons in hand. On stage, Leah froze. I took her hand. You don't owe them anything, I whispered. She spoke anyway, clear, fierce. We were never yours to own. The crowd rose. Reporters asked about Everett. We said nothing. Silence was its own power. This time, the story belonged to the survivors. A girl named Nina arrived at the shelter with a spoon necklace. I saw your video, she said. Her arms were bruised. Leah knelt beside her. You're safe now, Nina whispered. Can I carve one? We handed her a journal and knife. Hours later, she showed us her spoon, tiny, jagged, perfect. It said mine. We cried, not out of sadness but because it was working. The stories, the symbols, the fight, it all meant something. It was multiplying. Our shelter expanded. A second opened in Oregon, then Texas. Celeste helped screen counselors. Clara trained outreach teams. Leah ran support calls. I rebuilt homes. Each night, survivors left spoons on the front table, carved, painted, burned, broken. Each one told a story. A senator visited. Speechless. We didn't need applause. We needed safety, justice, growth. When I looked at Leah, holding a newborn rescued just days ago, I thought, this is what it means to rewrite legacy. One night, I found Leah carving in silence. Her spoon had no word, just notches. One for every woman who made it out. She looked up. It's not enough, she said. I took her hand. It's more than they ever wanted us to have. We buried the first spoon in Celeste's garden. A final goodbye to what once was. The soil felt sacred. Leah smiled. Let them grow. We weren't just ending cycles, we were planting new ones. Years later, I read a headline: Spoon Movement passes Protection Act. The bill passed unanimously. Survivors would now be protected, supported, and believed. I sat with Leah on our porch. The journal open in my lap. Clara called crying. Celeste danced in the kitchen. Nina sent photos of her graduation. I carved one last spoon, plain strong. I handed it to Leah. What should we call it? I asked. She smiled. The beginning, and it truly was. I sat in the quiet, journal in hand, flipping through every gate Leah had drawn. Each one different, open, broken, rebuilt. The spoon I carved last year rested on the shelf, untouched since the bill passed. Celeste painted again. Clara taught school. Leah laughed more freely. I still checked doors twice, still flinched at raised voices. Healing wasn't a finish line, it was a rhythm, and we were dancing to it, clumsy, defiant. Together, freedom didn't end, it echoed. Every spoon we carved told a story. Some were jagged, others smooth. But none were perfect. That was the point. Survivors weren't here to be beautiful, they were here to be free. I saw it in the way Nina trained others, how Clara wept at graduations, how Celeste hummed as she weeded her garden. Leah whispered once, do you think of the last? I answered, as long as we do, we weren't just survivors anymore, we were architects of hope. Everett's land was seized, turned into a recovery center. Survivors returned not to fear but to rebuild. Celeste planted a tree where the barn once stood. Clara led workshops in the old hall. Leah painted murals of gates wide open. I installed windows, real ones, that let in light. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer ruled us. That place became what it never was, safe. And every nail I drove whispered the same word, home. Leah teaches at the center now. Kids call her Miss L. She keeps the first spoon on her desk beside the journal. Visitors ask about it, and she simply says, "It saved me." I walk the halls each morning, tools in hand, fixing what breaks because things will break. But now we know how to mend. Our story didn't end, it grew, not into legend, but into lives. Ordinary, messy, beautiful lives. That's a real legacy. That's enough.